It focuses on the Global South, and it is Global South-led. It is led by people from the regions themselves.
Our next speaker is Katya Burns, a policy analyst, researcher, and activist with 2 decades of experience working on human rights, health, and climate issues across the globe, including with the United Nations. Her work focuses on the connections between animal agriculture, climate change, equity, and biodiversity. In her presentation, Katya will explore how to move beyond Western funding models and create new, locally rooted approaches to support animal rights and welfare in the Global South. So please welcome Katya Burns.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Katya, and this is the title of my presentation. And I think when I thought about this presentation at the beginning, I was thinking I'll discover all kinds of new, innovative, locally rooted approaches. And I think that's actually going to be something that's going to be a bit of a co-creation, but I'm going to share with you what I have so far. And just to give a little more background on myself, so I've been working as a consultant for about 20 years, and mostly in Africa and Asia. So my examples that I'm going to share today are all from that region of the world. And my work has looked at local development, and it's looked at international organizations and how they support local development and local health initiatives. I've done a lot of work on tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV, and also on gender and human rights. And then over the past 5 years, I've increasingly been working on animals, which is something that I always wanted to work on, and trying to take the lessons I learned from the work I did in health and development and think about, hey, how can we apply these for animal rights and for animal welfare? The field of global health is quite developed until recently, as probably everybody knows. It's suffered a lot of funding cuts recently, but so I thought, well, we can really try to learn something from that experience. What is going to be helpful? And so my presentation focuses on the funding model, but it also looks at the way that animal rights organizations, animal welfare organizations are working in the Global South, not only how they fund themselves, but also how they work. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I just wanted to acknowledge the funders for some of the research I did. So the first grant I got a research grant from this organization called the Culture and Animals Foundation. It's US-based. I'm Canadian, by the way, and I live in the United States, and they funded me to do work on the intersection between animal welfare and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in case anybody doesn't know. And then more recently, right now, I have a grant from the Japan Foundation that is funding from the Japanese government. And it looks at my work and my team's work, I put a team together, looks at the intersection between the welfare of chickens, laying hens, and zoonotic disease. The intersection between the way hens are raised to produce eggs and the onset of bird flu. So those are 2 things that I'm working on right now. And I just wanted to acknowledge the funders. So this is what my presentation looks like, more or less. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the issue, factory farming in the Global South. So a lot of us think about factory farms as a global north phenomenon, but it's also present, from what I can see, in the Global South. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is the response, the rise of animal rights-focused civil society in the Global South. So that kind of activism, those kinds of activities have been so important in the global health arena, and so they are for animals as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding model. And I think all of us are always interested in funding. There never seems to be enough of it. And even in global health, which was well-funded, really for civil society and non-governmental organizations, it's always a struggle, and so it is for animals. And I'll talk a little bit about the funding model for animals and also what we can learn from global health in terms of funding civil society organizations in the global south. And then I'll talk about opportunities, strategies, and ways forward in the global south. So just some of my ideas, some of which are a little more preliminary than I thought they would be. So this is some data that I pulled from the World Animal Protection. This is the data on the total number of animals on factory farms, comparing north and south. And as you can see, for each of these categories of animals, there are far more animals on factory farms in the global south than the global north. This is data from 2021, and the numbers have only increased from what I can tell. So for cows in the global north, almost 54 million, but the global south is 94 million. You can see that there's a huge discrepancy here. So this just shows you that factory farming is really a phenomenon in the global south, according to this data. World Animal Protection put this together for the COP28 report, which is the climate summit report 2 years ago. Not only are factory farms proliferating across the global south, but meat consumption is also increasing. So the rate of meat consumption is increasing globally, but it's growing significantly faster in the global south than the global north. And one reason for that is that the baseline is very low. So it means that people were not eating that much meat in the beginning, but so they're increasing quite steeply, while in the global north, the meat consumption level is already quite high. And this is some data also from World Animal Protection that predicts in 2021 data within 10 years, a 30% increase in meat consumption in Africa, 18% in Asia and the Pacific, and 12% in South America. And here are some data that I said we don't know, although I was recently informed that actually we do know some of it. I'm hoping people in the audience will share that with us after this talk. But at least I didn't see the data on how many of those factory farmed animals from the global south are consumed locally and how many are exported, although I believe most of them indeed are exported, in fact, to the global north. But there's new data also that's going to be coming out on exports from World Animal Protection. They have a new tool that collects this data. I believe it will be open access on their website in October. And I just saw a presentation by them last week. It was really interesting. And precise data on the destination flows of factory farm animals, I haven't seen it compiled in one kind of analytical report, although I understand that data is available. So I think there's still research to be done here, or at least to be analyzed, data to be analyzed and presented in a consumable way. So I just wanted to give you all an idea of what activism is looking like in the global south. So I put this list together. I'm not going to read it all out, but for most of these organizations, these are local organizations. So I think animal activism, animal rights, and animal welfare work in the global south, it's both kind of indigenous with these some of these grassroots organizations. And this is only a small list. I also haven't seen an exhaustive list of all of these organizations, and that's something that needs to be put together. And additionally, of course, there are global north organizations, large organizations that work on animal welfare and animal rights that are also working and have affiliates or branches throughout the global south. And I know some of those people are here today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. So these are the local ones. And yeah, for the Asia ones, I was actually fortunate to be attending the Asia for Animals conference, which is a big animal rights and welfare conference for Asia that's held every 2 years, and I was there last week. It was in Taiwan, and these are some of the organizations that attended that that meeting. And for the Africa ones, this summer in July, there was a AVA conference in Kenya, and because I'm not really familiar with all the Africa organizations, many of these are sourced from that. And that was, I believe, one of the first sort of animal rights pro-vegan conferences held on the continent of Africa. So then I started thinking about the funding approach. Like, how are these organizations, as they work in the Global South, where are they getting their money, they need to be funded. Are they funded in the best possible way? Can we think about other ways to fund them? And so most of the funding, from what I've been able to trace, and I have not researched this exhaustively, but from what I've been able to trace, most of the funding for the work in the Global South, it tends to come from Global North organizations. So there's a funding flow, and so it is with development funds as well. And the approach, most of the approach for funding is in 3 categories, like no surprise, right? Philanthropic approach, there's grants, there's high net worth individuals, and then there's some kind of a version of crowdfunding, click on the site and fund. And I started to wonder, are these approaches, are these the most appropriate? Are they aligned with the national institutions? Are they right for the culture? And are there any missed opportunities? And that was the question that kind of drove me to put this presentation together. And what I noticed actually is that there are many people in the Global South making exactly this point, right? That, well, this is great, but is this really aligned with my country? Is the funding approach going to work for us? And indeed, is the entire approach going to work for us? So I think one of the main things we learned in global health is the incredible importance, as I'm sure we all know, of listening to the people who are there instead of telling people what the best practice is, and also to be conscious of the fact that what works for us here in Europe or North America might not work in Africa or in Asia. So listening is something that's really critical. And then I just wanted to highlight this one philanthropy, which I'm guessing there are people in this room who know more about it than I do, but from what I can see, I've been very impressed. So this philanthropy funds organizations, animal rights organizations and welfare organizations in the Global South, and it focuses on the Global South, and it is Global South led. It is led by people from the regions themselves, and that's another critical point that we learned in global health. The leadership and the decision-making power has to be with those people who know the culture and know the context the best, because they actually know how to get things done. I did have a look at their sources of funding, and it looks to me that they're mainly from the Global North, but I could be wrong. So I just wanted to highlight some of the types of opportunities that I thought would be good to look at, and I've already seen organizations in the Global South looking at these types of opportunities, and I'm also really interested in hearing from you guys what you think opportunities might be. But these are some of the ones that I want to highlight just from my experience working internationally. So one of them is economic development funds. So what I'm trying to talk about here is situating animal rights work within the context of the country that where the work is taking place, thinking about what are the national priorities, and a lot of these countries are developing countries, so they're going to be getting all kinds of, there's a gap in the presentation, I don't know, now it's gone, amazing. They're going to be getting all kinds of development funds, and we'll look a little bit more closely about what that means. And is there a way for animal rights organizations to hook into those funds? And why is that beneficial? That is beneficial not only because you might be getting actual financial benefit from it, but it's because it will fit into the whole kind of national priority, and that is something that in global health we always call it sustainable. It means it gets buy-in from people in the country who have control over the policies that we want to influence, policies about farmed animals, for example, and also who have control over the national budget. Climate funds, I'm going to talk about that because as you know, the Global South is much more impacted by climate change than the Global North, even though the Global North is largely, primarily responsible for climate change. And finally, funding on equity and rights. So these, I'll go through each one of these, but these are 3 areas that I thought were promising, but they're not the only ones. And I think together we could come up with some other ones as well. So yeah, this was a diagram that I thought I'd put together to demonstrate how to start thinking about the sources of funding for working on animal rights and animal welfare in the Global South. So one is animals in economic development, how do they fit in, and where's the funding? What kinds of funding is it? There's funding that addresses issue of poverty, that builds infrastructure, that supports employment through things like microloans. Those are the kinds of funding that could come in that area. How can we fit animals into that? Can we get some funding in that area? The second one is animals and climate change. As I said, the Global South is disproportionately affected. And then animals and global inequality and human rights. I feel like this is an area that could be developed so much more. And I'll talk about this in a subsequent slide, but this is an area that our movement has been aware of for decades, and yet I think it could be brought out a little bit more. So, okay, so here's some ideas I put together about funding animal advocacy with development funds, and these are the kinds of sources of funding that there might be in a country for development. One is a national government, such as the Ministry of Agriculture. It might sound crazy to think about getting funding from the Ministry of Agriculture for animal rights, but it's actually, I think, something that is feasible. And one thing I found fascinating last week when I was participating in the conference in Taiwan is that this is a conference about animal rights, and there were representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture there who wanted to learn. So I thought this was really a positive sign. Then there's development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. They'll be having financial flows into Asian countries for economic development. And the African Development Bank, there's international organizations such as the UN, and then there's bilateral government donors. And here are some of the types of areas that they might be investing in. And I wanted to highlight these 2 kind of approaches that we could think about for funding animal activism within the context of economic development. One is to integrate animals into existing programs by emphasizing the collective benefits. I'll give an example because I know it sounds kind of out there. And the other one is countering programs that exploit animals by demonstrating the collective harms. So let's give an example. I got an example for this one. So this was actually an organization that I happened to talk to at this regional Asian conference last week, and it was an animal shelter in India. So a shelter in a developing country, if you've ever been to one, it's not like here. I don't know what Luxembourg's like, but it's not like in Canada where you'll have mainly abandoned pets. They do take in abandoned pets, but they also have a lot of street dogs. And then they'll also be taking donkeys and buffalo and cows and, camels. So anybody who needs help. And so this shelter, I was talking to one of the people who leads the shelter, and he was looking for funds outside the traditional way of raising funds. So they've been raising funds in the ways that I had outlined earlier, right, with grants and doing like crowdfunding and individual donors, small donors, a lot of small donors, which is a fantastic way. But he said, our expenses are going up and we need to find something new. So these here are 2 things that they are exploring. So he pointed out that their shelter employs, it's a small town in a fairly rural area of India, and they employ 40 people. And he said, you know, we're really contributing to the local economy because those people all have families, and we are supporting those families, and we are helping those kids go to school, and we want to benefit from some kind of development fund, so we're investigating possible opportunities through the United Nations Development Program, which I thought I had a logo for here, but maybe it's somewhere else. And then also, he mentioned that their shelter is severely impacted by climate change, namely flooding. So flooding has been a real issue everywhere, and as we know, it's getting worse. And so they're looking into accessing funds, state funding for climate adaptation. So this looked like a really promising approach to me, and something that I really want to continue to support and work on. So this is another way of looking for funding, and could be really useful for organizations in the Global South, is finding that intersection between animals and climate change. So I just threw up a few arguments here, which are pretty well known if you've looked at this. I'm not sure how many of you have, but this is sort of the impact of animal agriculture on climate change. And these are arguments that could be used to gather resources to, oppose factory farming, for example. So greenhouse gas emissions, animal agriculture produces more greenhouse gas emissions than transportation, global transportation, cars, planes, trains, and ships combined. And then the impact of animal agriculture on land, cutting forests to grow animal feed and provide pasture for farmed animals drives carbon dioxide emissions and is the largest global source of methane and nitrous oxide, which are both very potent greenhouse gases. And then, of course, the impact of animal agriculture on water. So this is, I think, from Cowspiracy, which I'm sure most of you have seen, right? On a per kilogram basis, beef production requires 9 times the water of cereals. So these are the kinds of arguments that can be used to garner climate resources for animal welfare and animal rights activism. And these are some of the types of meetings that are useful to attend. And actually, this is an area where animal activists have become the most involved already in climate change work. And this is a small one I wanted to put in on health. So there's a concept of One Health. If you haven't heard about it before, this is the diagram. It's supported by the World Health Organization, and it links animal health with human health and environmental health. At the intersection is One Health. And along with that, this is, of course, linked to zoonotic diseases. If you don't look at this kind of intersection of these 3 factors, then zoonotic disease is often what you get, and that is, of course, what happened. And there's recently been a pandemic agreement that was signed this year by the World Health Organization. So this also offers opportunities for looking for resources. One way it does that is that these One Health funds are allocated to countries to work on this issue, improving this kind of triangle of health, animal health, human health, environmental health. And when that money is allocated, a discussion ensues at the country level about how to use that funding. And that is also an entry point for animal activists to try to increase funding for animal health. From what I understand, I haven't seen a formal review of how this is working, but what tends to happen in those country discussions is that human health and environmental health are really emphasized while animal health is less emphasized, so that is something that requires more work. And finally, this is the final area that I thought there really could be an opportunity for getting resources, and that is this link between animal rights and human rights. And I haven't seen as much work in this area or as much use of these arguments as I think there could be, even though since 1971, this incredibly powerful argument was made in Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore-Lappé, who wrote, "As long as the poor and hungry cannot pay, grain and soybean growers will find it more profitable to sell to the rich countries where food will be called feed and reduced to a tiny fraction of its real potential. So she already was making that link between human rights and animal rights and the way that the industrialization of animal agriculture has driven human misery as well. So if you're working on human rights, then you should also look at animal rights. But as I'm sure you know, that connection has not adequately been made. And if you've tried to make the connection as I have, you know, it can be quite frustrating. But I think this argument is powerful, and there is funding for work on human rights globally, including across the global south. And so here's a few points that I put together that could be useful if any of you want to make this argument, or if you're working with people in the global south who want to make this argument. So 82% of the world's malnourished children live in countries where locally grown food is fed to animals who are then killed and sold to consumers in wealthy countries. This is about human rights, it's about equity. Communities that were previously food sufficient have seen their land purchased, leased, or expropriated by big businesses, expanded into monocultures of wheat and soy that is shipped to wealthy countries as animal feed. This is the dynamic that's happening across the global south. I've seen it in Africa. And then finally, a quarter of all crops grown is fed to animals, half of all protein, and over 1/3 of all calories produced, pushing food prices upwards and eroding the ability of poor people everywhere to feed themselves. So that doesn't mean that animal agriculture is the only force driving food prices, but it's one of them, as is zoonotic disease as well. And yeah, so those are the ideas I wanted to share with you, and I want to let you know, so tomorrow we'll have a workshop on this where we can kind of workshop it and discuss what the various approaches, and we'll do some case studies, and I think it'll be pretty fun because I'm sure I have a lot to learn from all of you. And this is a slogan which I don't know if you use, this was used a lot in HIV. So when we started working HIV really got, the global push to work on HIV really got going around 2001, and at the time it was very top-down, and pretty soon this was the slogan that came up. So those who are affected are the ones who have to lead it. Nothing about us without us, and I think it's really great when we're thinking about animal activism in the global south as well. So this is what our little workshop will look like tomorrow: co-creation, case studies, and developing practical approaches. What can we do as global north activists? What can global south activists do? And how can we interact with one another to make this the most productive and impactful intervention? So that's what I wanted to share with you. This is me. This is my email address. If any of you guys want to work on this or come up and talk to me, just I'd be really happy to do that, or email me anytime. So this is what I'm going to be working on for a while. So I'm happy to work with anybody here. And I think that's it.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Katya. We do have time for some questions. Does anyone have a question here? Or anyone from the online audience, perhaps? Or a comment? Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering how the donor pressures will be if we move away from funding within the animal movement and go towards UNDP, for example, right? So the UNDP has their own set of things that they want to achieve with their funding. When animal groups go and ask for that money, how will that pressure affect the animal groups?
Okay, if I understood the question correctly, it's if animal groups get involved in UNDP funding, will they be impacted by UNDP? Is that what you're asking?
Not necessarily impacted, but how will the UNDP, UNDP has their own set of things that they want to achieve with their funding. The animal rights or animal welfare work has their own set of things that they want to achieve. Maybe they're not in alignment. How will that pressure from UNDP affect what the animal rights groups can do with the funding from UNDP?
Yeah, okay. I mean, generally when I'm getting funding from UNDP, it'll be a consortium of organizations, for example. So an animal rights organization could be one part of that consortium. And I guess the most important thing in the beginning to do is to find the point where the interests of the animal organization and the interests of the donor coincide. So find, I guess one example would be, not from UNDP, but say WHO, zoonotic disease. We all want to stop zoonotic diseases, right? But WHO maybe have their own idea. We have our own idea, which is like, don't factory farm chickens, right? But so you could bring in a coalition of people and have that kind of sweet point where we have something to contribute. But I would say that, of course, as with any donor who's not just completely dedicated to your cause, there's a negotiation process. And that process not only should generate funds for the animal rights organization, but also start to influence the donor. It's kind of a give and take. So, I mean, of course, it's like you won't get funding for every single thing you want to do, but you will get some funding to begin to work with that donor. And in that process, you will influence them and the other people in the consortium. Does that make sense?
Okay, does anyone else have a question or comment? Yes.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I have a question regarding like this One Health or planetary health approach. So I work in public health in Switzerland, and there's this trend and research to fund more and to promote more projects that follow like this One Health or planetary health approach, which has its advantages. But of course, as you said, with the One Health approach, there could be a drawback that people tend to focus on some areas more than in others. And I don't know anything about funding, but maybe you have an opinion. Do you think it's more beneficial if like these funding schemes stay within their compartments? Or do you see a big advantage of like funding really focusing on like One Health projects or something like that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I see an advantage to collaborating outside of our movement. So I would say, yes, I think I see an advantage to working across all three of those. And the main advantage is not funding, it's to grow the movement, it's to have an impact. We need to convince people who are not already convinced. So once we start interacting with people who are working on human health and are working on the environmental health, then I can only see a plus in that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? Does anyone here have a question or a comment? Excuse me. All right, then I want to say thank you, Katya, for your great presentation. Thank you.